Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Barbara Honegger. Barbara has served in high-level positions in the U.S. government, including White House policy analyst, special assistant to the President and director of the Attorney General's Law Review at the Department of Justice. From 1995 to 2011, Ms. Honegger served as senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School, the premier science, technology, and national security affairs graduate research university for the Department of Defense. Her pioneering book, October Surprise, on the deep story behind the Iran side of the Iran-Contra scandal, subsequently confirmed by formerly classified documents and deathbed confessions of key conspirators, led to a full subpoena power of congressional reinvestigation funded at the level of the 9/11 Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome for Barbara Honegger.
I'm not as tall as you.
You want me to take this down?
Oh yeah, take that. And 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
You got it all.
All right, I've got 50 minutes to load you with some pretty explosive information. All right, thank you so much first to Don and to Judith Barry Baker for this great honor of being able to address you. The last two conferences, when they found out I was here, they stuck me in even though I wasn't on the program, so I guess third time's the charm. I get to actually be on the program this year. Okay. So the title of my presentation, and this was Judith's recommendation after I gave her my summary, is an insider's view of the road from JFK to 9/11. I suppose the reason that she thinks I'm an insider, I want to go on the record, I am definitely not an insider about the JFK assassination. I have been a government insider. This is me in the cabinet room. I was a policy analyst in the West Wing of the White House and later in the Department of Justice in the first administration of Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. and when he was vice president for Reagan, and that is, of course, George Bush Sr. on the right, who figures prominently in this presentation. I modeled after Judith asked me to use this title for my presentation. As you'll see at the end of my presentation, I had originally proposed a different one. I'm going to end my presentation with that originally proposed title and why I chose it. But once I agreed to the title that Judith requested, I would just want to remind you that one of the very finest books that is already linked the JFK assassination to many other deep state acts, crimes of state or state crimes, deep state crimes, is the Professor Peter Dale Scott's wonderful book, The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. I highly recommend it. This is Peter Dale Scott, a 40-year friend and colleague of mine. And he's probably best known for being the father of the word deep state, and look where it's got us. Anyway, this is another great book by Professor Peter Dale Scott. So in his book, The Road to 9/11, the first one I showed you, Professor Scott details how the national security deep state brought its World War II and Cold War covert operations and assassinations expertise, in quotes, home to the United States, and how getting away with the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK in turn led to their confidence they could get away with Iran-Contra, and it's the real story of Iran-Contra, the deep story of Iran-Contra, especially the Iran-Gate side of Iran-Contra. It's a lot more explosive than the official story has led you to believe, which is detailed in my book, October Surprise. They also did Oklahoma City. They then did the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993, and then they did 9/11. This is my book, October Surprise, which is available. It's been so long since it came out in May 12th of 1989. I think you can now buy it for about 89 cents plus shipping and handling on Amazon. So after I became the first public resignation of conscience from the Reagan Bush Senior White House, and that's another story for another day. I came back to my home in the Monterey Peninsula of California in Carmel Valley, which happens to be where Mae Brussell lived. And one day she appeared at my door. That's another story for another day. But I immediately almost met Mae Brussell, who sought me out. And I know she is very well loved in the JFK assassination community. And this is a wonderful picture of Mae, exactly like I worked with her. I was the one person she trusted to work with her in her home. And I did that in the last year of her life. Mae said to me that she believed in all of her research at the time that she told me, which was 1988, that the head of what she called the Nazi deep CIA Hydra was none other than the person that I worked in the White House with Reagan, George Bush Sr., whose father was Hitler's banker in New York. She wanted to know why CIA headquarters is named for George Bush Sr. when he was only director for such a short period of time. I mean, that's a really good question. Now, briefly, my book, October Surprise, and I hope you read it. It's very cheap on Amazon today. It is about Bush Sr.'s double coup, an actual coup and an attempted coup. The actual coup was the October Surprise. The attempted coup was the Reagan assassination attempt. Bush and Reagan, Bush Sr. and Reagan, stole the 1980 election for the two of them. Theodore Shackley was an operator, a top operator in the October Surprise, under then Reagan-Bush campaign manager William Casey, who then went on to become Reagan's first director of the CIA. Bush Sr. was then, based upon my research, it's in my book October Surprise, I believe he was the key player behind the Reagan assassination attempt, which many people forget about because it didn't succeed. We remember the ones that succeeded. But Bush Sr., in my opinion, his cabal, the whole purpose of the October Surprise was to get the two of them in place and then to take Reagan out very quickly, which they tried only a few months after the inauguration. And the whole point was to get Bush in there in the presidency to control everything a lot earlier than he actually did. Took him another 8 years. And I just want to remind you in passing that the last time a candidate happened to also be a Republican, secretly, therefore, my book October Surprise, colluded with a hostile foreign power to influence a U.S. presidential election, and where have you heard that? It's kind of in the news today in the front pages of all of our papers. It was actually the October Surprise. And if you listen to the mainstream press and even the alternative press today, they're going to tell you that the so-called Russia-Trump campaign collusion, nothing ever happened like it in American history. That is not true, assuming it's true. I'm not taking a position on that. Mae Brussell's main message to me in the year that I worked with her, and believe me, that was like being thrown into the bathwater, throwing the baby into the bathwater. My God, when I first started working for Mae and she would fill my head, I would get there about 10 in the morning, we'd have lunch, we'd work, we'd have dinner, I'd go home 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week at her home in Carmel Valley, which is also where I live in the Monterey Peninsula of California. She would fill my head, and at the beginning I thought, my head's going to explode. It's not possible that everything she's telling me is true, but over time I've realized it is, and it's actually a lot worse than Mae thought. So these were her messages. I'm trying to summarize her messages to me and to the world through her writings and her weekly radio shows that went on for over 850 weekly radio shows right there in the Monterey Peninsula of California. The deep state, she believed from her research, is the deep CIA military intelligence complex. They're the same thing. The deep CIA MIC, for military industrial complex, from her research are the Nazis, and by that she meant the Hitler Nazis originally. Their goal, in her opinion, was to make America into the Fourth Reich, literally. And at that time, during the Cold War, to defeat the Soviet Union, which in turn had defeated Hitler. Kennedy stood in their way, wanted peace with the Soviet Union, wanted peace on Earth. Wanted even the Apollo moon landing program to be a joint U.S.-Soviet effort, and that was anathema to the so-called deep state. and that the Nazi deep CIA military-industrial complex killed Kennedy, RFK, and MLK, installed Bush as vice president by the October surprise treason, which is the real story behind the Iran side of Iran-Contra, and tried to assassinate Reagan to immediately install Bush as president of the United States, the latter of which failed, thank God. This is maybrussel.com. Every single one, the audio tapes of every single one of her programs, her radio programs, is at maybrussel.com. And this is a really great book about Mae Brussel. And again, as I mentioned, in May's mind, by deep CIA, she meant the Nazis, and she meant the Hitler Nazis. Her programs speak for themselves, that book speaks for itself, all of her radio shows speak for themselves, but I'm just giving you some of the highlights. She focused on many of these areas. That Hitler's Gehlen organization that he ran to penetrate the Soviet Union became the deep CIA and became the CIA equivalent in Germany, the BND. That Werner von Braun, of course, came over with Project Paperclip, became our U.S. space program. Otto Skorzeny was Hitler's top commando assassin. And he came, he was brought in 1948. He was taken out of a Camp King, a POW camp, and he was put in charge of training about, according to my friend Daniel Sheehan, the famous attorney who also lives in the Monterey Peninsula, California. We got a lot of interesting people there. You should come visit. According to Danny Sheehan, his sources, he claims inside the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, there were, Otto Skorzeny trained approximately 1,000 top commando assassins in a network across all of the World War II allies, including, amazingly, Israel, the Mossad, the original Mossad. She focused on the Nazi doctors, which are going to be very important here in a moment, from my own personal experience, including Mengele, Dr. Morell, who was Hitler's personal physician, and a man you're going to hear about in a few moments, Dr. Gerald Klein, and that these, the Nazi doctors and the black science that they did just seamlessly went into our MK Ultra program here in the CIA in the United States. She focused especially on certain individuals. The one she really focused on a lot was one of Hitler's top generals, Fritz Kramer, whom she believed was the same Fritz Kramer who was brought over to become number 3 in the Pentagon of the United States to lead up plans and policy in the U.S. Department of Defense. She believes he's the same Fritz Kramer who then ran the White House National Security Council and recruited Henry Kissinger into Army military intelligence. She focused, of course, on Martin Bormann, who ran the entire post-war network of Nazi front companies. That was also used by the CIA, NATO, etc., and our allies. All right. These are just some links, and anyone who would like to have my PowerPoint slides, just let me know. Give me your email address, and I will send them to you. The Nazi connection to the JFK assassination is probably May's most important and well-known article, and I've got a number of other good links here about the Nazi connection to the CIA. This is not my own research, but I have had some personal experiences I'm going to share with you that support in very striking and even shocking ways what May believed. She told me that Bush's top man was Theodore Shackley. He was known as the Blonde Ghost. He was CIA Director Bush Sr.'s Deputy of Covert Operations, ran assassination programs like the Phoenix program, drug running for the CIA, narcotics running, etc. That's a great article about him. That's the book about him, one of the books about him, The Blonde Ghost. If only May had been alive for this incredible vindication, which came out last year at the other conference. I'm not sure if it was called Kappa then. It might have been called Lancer then. But in any case, last year I attended the presentation of U.S. Air Force Major Ralph Gannis. He has published a book called The Skorzeny Papers, and every single person on the planet needs to read this book. Otto Skorzeny He was Hitler's top special operations commando assassin, and as I mentioned, trained up to 1,000 special ops assassin network for the Allies after World War II, including, amazingly, the Mossad. And this is critical. The CIA's liaison to that training program, which was in Spain, near Madrid, was none other than Bush's top man, Theodore Shackley. The U.S. Command Authority tapped Skorzeny and his long-established Dallas network to activate French assassin Jean-René Sautré. Am I mispronouncing that? Sautré? Sautré, to kill JFK, according to Air Force Major Ralph Gannis's research, and also to a great presentation that unfortunately I missed yesterday on Thursday here at this very conference by Gary. So I met Gary just a little bit ago, and Casey Quinlan. Casey Quinlan, and he invited me to look at his PowerPoint that I missed yesterday and to use some of his slides if they were valuable, and they're extremely valuable. You need to get his PowerPoint as well for his presentation. So I have shamelessly used some of his slides, and I'm giving him great credit for it. So please do get the PowerPoint. I need to go through these very quickly, but Operation Gladio was a secret army created by the CIA, MI6, and basically the World War II allies in the late 40s, starting at least by 1950. And it trained these special operations commando assassins under Skorzeny. He was the head of the training program. Again, this is the man that, according to Ralph Gannis, that Otto Skorzeny's personal papers, which he came into the possession of in an auction 4 or 5 years ago, went through them, blew his mind, and the arrow points at the Skorzeny networks being activated to bring this assassin into Dealey Plaza for the JFK assassination. Just one of the shooters. Okay. There we go. Now this is very important. And I should say that I came to what I'm going to tell you is the link, believe it or not, between the JFK assassination and 9/11, the attacks of September 11th, 2001, through a man by the name of General Lyman Lemnitzer. And you're going to see why I consider him to be like the spider in the middle of the web of the Kennedy assassination, the man who almost certainly activated or was in a position to activate the French shooter that Ralph Gannis has identified as one of the shooters from the Skorzeny network, the Nazi, World War II Skorzeny Nazi network in Dallas. So I came kind of to JFK and the Lemnitzer centrality of Lemnitzer to the JFK assassination because I found he was so important for 9/11 as a kind of intellectual mastermind of the actual plot of what really happened on 9/11, not what you've been told happened on 9/11. We're going to get into that. So it's very important that those schools I told you about, those assassin training schools, special ops training schools of Skorzeny's in Spain, beginning about 1948, that they were specifically conceived by, amongst others, General Lyman Lemnitzer and then Commander Allen Dulles. They were in the OSS. All right. And then, of course, the OSS morphed into the CIA. Now, I'm trying to get this to go. Oh, there we go. So these assassinations, these are the slides of my colleague. These assassination schools in Madrid were designed to be protected, designed, protected, and implemented through NATO, the United States Pentagon, Department of Defense, etc. Trying to move that forward. Oh, I understand. All right. Now, believe it or not, for my book October Surprise, and this blew my mind, but when I did my book October Surprise, like many of us researchers, you start out as an amateur and you get to be pretty good at it after a little while if you go to original sources, primary sources. I did that for my book, October Surprise. I was in the Reagan-Bush campaign at the very highest level, had certain experience that then suddenly made sense because I'd had that personal experience in the most secure room of the headquarters of the Reagan-Bush campaign in 1980. Once Iran-Contra started spilling out in late 86 and into 87, in the Iran-Contra hearings, I realized, I immediately remembered what I had experienced in the Reagan-Bush campaign, put it together and started my research. When I did my book, as I was doing my book, October Surprise, I was going public on radio and television all over the country for a number of years. From late 1986 until my book was published on May 12th of 1989. So that's a good period of time. And while I was doing that and going public, I was contacted by a man who wouldn't tell me who he was. He just called himself Mr. Y. All right? And so Mr. Y is a source in my book, and I call him Mr. Y in the book because he insisted upon remaining anonymous. Subsequently, that's a story for another day, I learned his identity and confirmed his identity, and he later came out publicly with his identity. His name is Oswald Lewinter. At least one of his AKAs was Oswald Lewinter. Believe it or not, well after my book was published, not until 1992, which was like 3 years later, I watched a BBC special called Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio was this network that was run by Lemnitzer when he was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO after he had been one of JFK's Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking U.S. military active duty officer in our nation. And so there was this special on the Gladio operation in Europe throughout the Cold War, where the Pentagon and NATO worked together with the secret dark side of our allies' intelligence agencies, using assassins and assassin networks to kill innocent European civilians, sometimes mass murders like the Bologna train station massacre in Italy, to blame on the political left just before elections to try to keep them from getting votes. Just a terrible, terrible thing. And this happened routinely throughout the Cold War, and it was NATO, mostly NATO and the Pentagon working together who did this. Believe it or not, when this BBC special came out called Operation Gladio, State-Sponsored Terrorism in Europe, and I watched it, I almost lost consciousness. And the reason is that at 15:56, almost 16 minutes in to this BBC, hold it closer, I'm sorry. At almost 16 minutes in fact, it's 16 minutes in exactly, and I can give you the link to this documentary, which has been taken down by BBC, by the way, but it's in the Wayback Machine, and I've got the link in the Wayback Machine. Believe it or not, on the screen is Oswald Lewinter as the Pentagon's liaison to Gladio. And he was one of the two anonymous sources for my book, October Surprise. There were many on the record sources, but the Pentagon's liaison to the Gladio mass murder operations by NATO and the Pentagon was a key source for my book, which I did not know at the time. All right, now I'm going to give you an amazing experience in a nutshell. I think last year at this conference, in a very short presentation, I did talk about this, but probably not all of you were there. The ultimate evidence that Hitler's Nazis are the deep state, or at least were at the time of what I'm about to tell you, is this amazing experience that is detailed in a chapter in world-famous attorney Daniel Sheehan's book called The People's Advocate. Now, Daniel Sheehan is, if you don't know about him, he was one of the attorneys for the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case. He was one of Karen Silkwood's attorneys. He was the attorney for the Iran-Contra case against Secord, North, and Hakim, etc. He is an amazing attorney, and he wins his cases, all except for the Iran-Contra case, which, as you'll see, involved the CIA's secret drug profits, and they weren't going to let him win that case no matter what, and he didn't. But in this book, The People's Advocate, And Danny is a 40-year friend and colleague of mine, also lives in the Monterey Peninsula of California, as I do, and as Mae Brussel did. In this book, there is an incident that he recounts, which is mind-blowing. And the incident is, when he was in his office by the Capitol and the Christic Institute, at a time when George Bush Sr. was in control of these decisions, a man came into his office by the name of Burkholder Smith. And he was very rattled. And Burkholder Smith asked for a meeting with Danny. He was ushered in. And he told Danny Sheehan this incredible story that's in the book. And in a nutshell, what Burkholder Smith told Danny was that he, Burkholder Smith, at that time was the deputy station chief of the CIA in Mexico City. And that just a few days before, that he, Burkholder Smith, had gotten a call from a representative of, as I recall, then CIA Director George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., but definitely a top aide to Bush Sr., I think his chief of staff. And he was told, you know, we'd really like you to be able to keep your job as the deputy station chief of the CIA in Mexico City, but you're going to have to be vetted by some very important people. If you pass the vet, you can keep your job. You'll probably end up being station chief and be in the CIA for, you know, a lot longer. And, of course, he was being made an offer he couldn't refuse, so he said yes. He was picked up. He was blindfolded. I might get some of these details wrong, but here's the gist. Blindfolded, circles, get on a bus, get on a plane, fly a long distance, maybe get on another plane, circles in the air, lands, still the blindfold, gets in a vehicle, drives quite a ways. He figures he's in South America I guess he figured out the direction he was going and how long it took. They finally take the blindfold off. He's in this vehicle, and they're going over a hill down into this perfect little German village, turns out in Argentina. And he's ushered into the main room, which has a huge conference table with some very old Hitler-era Nazis, as well as some younger ones sitting around with a huge swastika above the fireplace. And he's basically told that he's there for a job interview. They'd really like it if he could keep his job and keep working in the CIA, but they have to ask him just one question. And that fundamental question was, if you keep your job, will you absolutely commit to doing nothing to interfere with our narcotics operations, which funds the CIA, the black funding for the really black operations that we're talking about. And of course, he realized if he said no, he probably wouldn't get out there alive. So he said, sure, yeah, no problem. And he made it back alive and went straight to Daniel Sheehan and told the story. Well, subsequently, we know that this vet was made of all of the CIA station chiefs and deputy station chiefs in all of their stations around the world. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the Nazis are above George Bush Sr., after whom CIA headquarters is named. I mean, you do the math. 2 + 2 = 4. Also, another amazing story from my personal experience, Mae Brussel believed that Hitler, or she gave great credence, that Hitler didn't die in the bunker. Now, I have not taken a position on it. Frankly, I'm 50-50 with what I've read. But I do have this amazing piece of confirmation from my own personal experience. I was working in the White House, the West Wing of the White House, right from Inauguration Day on, actually 5 days before Inauguration Day, when Bush Sr. and Reagan took over on January 20th of 1981. And it was not long after that that I was working late. I like working late when there aren't any interruptions. Everybody else goes home. And I was working late, second floor right over the office, Oval Office almost. Phone rings. And I was answering the phone because he was then gone for my boss, who was the Chief Domestic Policy Advisor, Dr. Martin Anderson, Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to Reagan. I answered the phone, and there was a man who started spieling his story, wanted me to take notes and put it in Dr. Anderson's inbox. I started taking those notes. And halfway through the conversation, I said, you know, what you're telling me is really important. He claimed to have found an enzyme that could separate dead skin cells from living skin cells. And if you can't do that in a very quick and efficient way, somebody can die from severe burns. And so he claimed that he wanted to give this great discovery to the United States military to save our military personnel in case they were, were injured from fire, explosions, etc. So I said, why don't you come in? And he said, what do you mean, come in? And I said, well, where are you? And he said, well, I'm at the Lafayette Hotel across, or the Hay Adams Hotel across Lafayette Square. And I said, okay, I'll just clear you in. What's your name? Well, I was like, Dorothy and Oz at the time. That was a very innocent and probably very stupid thing to do. But in the White House at that time, it's not true, I'm sure, anymore after 9/11, but it was called a trusted agent policy. So if you were trusted, anybody you brought in, they didn't ask questions. So here's this complete stranger. I get his name, Dr. Gerald Klein. I clear him in through the gate. And pretty soon he comes into the White House. I bring him up this little narrow stairway, sits at my desk, and I type what he's telling me. And then I say goodbye to him. And I say, I'll put this in Dr. Anderson's inbox. Thank you very much. And he leaves. A couple of nights, and I thought I'd never hear from him again. A couple of nights later, he calls me up. He says, I'm still in town doing business. I'm at the Hay Adams Hotel. You want to have dinner? And I thought, well, it was dinner time, and that happened to be my favorite place, the old gentleman's club there that they now allowed women. And so I said, sure. So I walked across Lafayette Square, and I had dinner with this gentleman. To make a long story short, at the dinner after we ordered, he took out an envelope, opened the envelope, and put face down a number of 8.5 by 11 black and white photographs, which I couldn't see originally. They were face down, and said, look at those. I turned them over, and what I was looking at clearly, as if those photographs were taken yesterday. They were absolutely crisp and clear. Black and white photos was of some kind of, during World War II, some kind of celebration dinner. There was a dais up above and round tables with white tablecloths, officers, Nazi officers in their dress uniforms, their wives in ball gowns, and on the dais was Hitler, probably Goebbels, I can't remember exactly. It was probably Himmler and Goebbels, maybe 5 or 6 people on the dais. But it was clear that one of them was the man sitting across from me. And I paused. And so I said, so who are you? And I looked through the photographs, and they were basically of the same event taken from slightly different angles. They were basically all the same photograph. I should have kept one. I should have asked to keep one. I wish I had, but I didn't think of it. So I passed them across the table to him. He put them back. We ordered, and then he told me that he had been, his name was Dr. Gerald Klein with a K, that he had been the deputy personal physician to Adolf Hitler, directly under Dr. Morell. That he lived in Dr. Morell's house, and that if Dr. Morell got sick, that he would take over. Well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Dr. Morell, we now know from declassified, from the now released, I believe the Soviets had them, but with the fall of the wall, we now have Dr. Morell's medical records of every single thing that he gave Hitler. And the bottom line is Hitler was given so many drugs you have no idea, but the most important one was speed. It was meth. And there were some days he couldn't get out of bed without having a shot of meth. And before a speech, he was given meth, which was one of the reasons he got so energetic and wild-eyed. Anyway, Dr. Klein, I didn't actually ask him, but presumably he administered those when Dr. Morell was not there to do so. This man, Dr. Gerald Klein, told me that he was good friends with George Bush Sr., that he was good friends with George Bush Sr.'s personal doctor, and that they both lived in Kennebunkport, Maine, which is, there's a lot of space between the houses, but he said Bush Sr. and Barbara Bush, Bush's doctor, and his house, Dr. Klein's house. So ask yourself, what does this mean? That one of Hitler's personal doctors knew George Bush Sr.'s personal doctor and lived right next to the two of them in Kennyport, Maine in 1981. Now, I mentioned that May believed that Hitler survived the bunker and went to Argentina originally. Some years later, not too many years ago, there was, maybe some of you have seen it, there's a great History Channel series called Hunting Hitler, and I believe it's episode 8, but it's one of the later episodes. And these are based upon now declassified FBI documents, where they had FBI informants informing the FBI, and that would get to Hoover or whoever was head of the FBI and into the deep state of the United States government. And they were apparently, according to this episode, they were following Hitler, who this informant or informants claimed arrived in a submarine together with 2 women. You can infer that one's Eva Braun, and that the other one is the female pilot that flew them out of Spain, and that the 4th individual was a doctor. Now I'm going to go back to one of my last days working for Mae Brussel. I worked with her in the last year of her life, in 1988. I told this to Mae Brussel over lunch, and when the name Dr. Gerald Klein came out of my mouth, I thought she was going to have a heart attack. She yelled out the name, and she said, "Oh my God, I have somewhere," and then she tried to find it, Dr. Gerald Klein is the name of the doctor who was on the sub with Hitler. Okay, so what May told me jives with what's in Hunting Hitler, that episode, except in the FBI documents, they didn't name the doctor. I believe that's Dr. Gerald Klein. It's from my own personal experience. This is Dr. Theodore Morell, and the man I met in the White House, didn't bring him into the White House again, believe me, never saw him again, worked under this man, gave Hitler his meth routinely. There's a number of wonderful books have come out. I recommend this one called Blitzed, about how drugs basically ran Nazi Germany, not just Hitler, but not only his military personnel on the front lines and otherwise, but civilians as well during the war. Dr. Morell and Hitler, Morell's on what I'm looking at my left. Dr. Morell was so critical to Hitler being able to function even, that in the bunker, until about 48 hours, 2 days as I recall from my reading, before Hitler allegedly died in the bunker, and I'm putting aside judgment on that. I'm 50-50 on that too. But what we do know is that Dr. Morell's lived in the bunker along with Hitler and Eva Braun, and right across the hall from Hitler, because he had to have his meth shots to function. And Hitler dismissed him about 2 days before he allegedly took his own life. I really like this graphic. This is, it's as if that's Hitler's head and the mask comes off, and on the inside it's Dr. Morell, or Dr. Gerald Klein, if you will, giving Hitler his meth injections. So who are these doctors? I think these doctors in Nazi Germany, they were clearly brought over to the United States. Dr. Klein lived, or claimed he lived, right next to George H.W. Bush and George H.W. Bush's personal doctor. As I recall, his name was something like Dr. Rudd. George H.W. Bush's personal doctor, who lived between them, he claimed. But here's another book. It's a more recent book, Dr. Feelgood, about, believe it or not, how JFK received meth shots as well, probably for his back pain, but I don't know. But I do recommend that book, and put it together with the other book, Blitzed. So what does all of this have to do with 9/11? What could it possibly have to do with the attacks of September 11th? There are surprising links between the JFK assassination and 9/11. And that's in the person of the architect of the assassination and of the mass murders of 9/11. This is a famous document. Many of you, if not all of you, are probably aware of it. It's called the Northwoods document. During the JFK administration, JFK's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military officer in the U.S. Pentagon, was General Lyman Lemnitzer. And this is the Northwoods document, which Lemnitzer, you can see his signature there at the bottom right. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, therefore he signed it, but every single one of the 5 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time signed onto it, And this is basically a number of scenarios that they're proposing to President Kennedy, trying to get his sign-off, which he would not give, thank God, to assassinate American civilians, to try to blame it on Castro as a pretext to invade, to put carefully selected passengers, probably CIA and Pentagon personnel, who would not die, but the public would be led to believe they'd been killed, put them on a civilian airliner or a non-military plane of some kind, swap it for a remote-controlled military drone, which they would then blow up pretty close to Cuba, blame it on Cuba as a pretext to invade Cuba. These are many, many different scenarios that they wanted, like a smorgasbord, multiple choice, for Kennedy to choose. Which one do you want? Which one of these illegal black ops do you want to pull off? And he said none of them. Did not ingratiate him to General Lemnitzer. That's an understatement. Operation Northwoods document. This is the actual document. If you get my PowerPoint slides, you can click on it or you can go to Google. It was signed by all the members of the Joint Chiefs. It was signed on to by all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by General Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, declassified in 1997. Okay, and I've already mentioned some of these scenarios, but the important one for 9/11 is that one of the scenarios presented to President Kennedy, as I mentioned, was to swap a civilian airliner that had been populated with carefully selected government passengers who would then survive for a remote-controlled military aircraft, basically a drone, and then blow it up to blame it on Castro in Cuba as a pretext to invade, which they were looking for if they couldn't kill Castro, they wanted to invade and kill him that way. This is General Lyman Lemnitzer, at the time JFK's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And these, this is one of the slides that I have, shamelessly used, and with his blessings. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. General Lyman Lemnitzer, Allen Dulles, a very important person, of course, kicked out of the head of the CIA by Kennedy and didn't ingratiate himself for doing that either. And Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's head spy, penetrating inside the Soviet Union during World War II, and then brought over his people were, many of them, brought into the CIA, into the OSS, which then merged into the CIA, and of course also basically became the West German intelligence agency, the BND equivalent of our CIA. So these men, Lemnitzer, Dulles, and Gehlen, were instrumental. They were absolutely central, actually, in establishing and setting up the Pentagon and NATO's Operation Gladio, false flag attack, mass assassinations or mass murders against innocent civilians throughout the Cold War in Europe, to blame on the political left. Okay, I'm going to go through some of these slides because they're basically about that. So the bottom line, as you're going to see in a moment, when I'm going to very quickly go through just some of the highlights of what really happened and didn't on 9/11, it's going to blow your mind. You're going to see that what the real story of 9/11, that it was an inside false flag self-attack by the United States deep state, the military intelligence deep state operatives against their own building, the Pentagon of the United States. And of course, in addition to pre-planning explosives in the World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2 and World Trade Center 7, not hit by a plane in New York City, to blame on the first fall guy, who was Al-Qaeda and allegedly run by bin Laden, and later another nested series of patsies. The one they're working on right now is Saudi Arabia. Okay, so you're going to see here in a moment why the template of that aspect of swapping a civilian airliner for a remote-controlled military plane that you then destroy, to blame it on someone you want to invade, a foreign country you want to invade, in this case first Afghanistan, then Iraq, and blah, blah, the so-called 9/11 wars, that's the real story of 9/11, not what you've been told by our government. Okay, so Lemnitzer as you're going to see, is basically the conceptual father of the template of the real story of what happened and didn't on 9/11. Also, you need to know that the actual September 11th attack scenario or template is not and was not without precedent. The title of the book by the co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission, Keenan Hamilton, the title of their book is Without Precedent, their book about the 9/11 attacks and what they went through to come up with the 9/11 Commission report in the summer of 2004. Their book is titled Without Precedent. And they want you to believe in that book, and they say so, and so does everybody else in the public government of the United States, that the skies of the United States had never, ever been cleared before, ever, ever in history. No one would have ever thought of it. That is a lie. And my source for this, believe it or not, I almost fell off my chair when I read it, is the Air Force's, the United States Air Force's own book, their official book about 9/11 and the Air Force involvement in it. And it goes into some history, and it's called Air War Over America. I highly recommend it. Get it on Amazon. And you will read there that once before 9/11, the United States Air Force, through the agency of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, that NORAD, once before, in 1961, under General Lyman Lemnitzer, it was his baby, it was his exercise, his military exercise or war game, that the entire skies over the United States were cleared, and there was an exercise that was dubbed the abbreviation Sky Shield 2. That was in October of 1961. And General Lyman Lemnitzer was the mastermind of this operation. And it should be pretty obvious to you when you see what I'm about to tell you, why that forms a template for what our own military and intelligence deep state did to almost 3,000 Americans on 9/11. In Lemnitzer's Sky Shield 2 exercise in October of 1961, as I said, the skies over the entire U.S. mainland were cleared of all civilian planes, every single one of them. You can go back to the microfiche from the day before, a few days before the day of the exercise and after, front page articles in the New York Times, microfiche, and you can read about Sky Shield 2. I went back and checked. During that exercise, Canada's military planes played red team attackers. They played Soviet nuclear bombers, starting to come to the United States, and our fighter jets played the U.S. defenders, the so-called blue team. And I don't know if you know this, but almost exactly the same thing was happening on the morning of 9/11. In fact, on the morning of 9/11 was the fifth day in a row. Let's see, September 8th, 9th, 10th, sorry, the fourth day in a row. These exercises on scenarios just like this started on September 8th of 2001, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th. And this has been acknowledged by the Air Force officer who is in charge of them. He has acknowledged this publicly, and you can read about that or watch or see that in my 9/11 documentary called Behind the Smoke Curtain. I'm going to give you the link to that, and I'm going to have DVDs of my updated second edition here probably in another hour. I forgot to bring them down. So come and get one from me if you would like it. It's also on YouTube, and you will have the link here in a moment. So here's the bottom line. The actual 9/11 operation, what really happened, and I'm about to give you some of the burning data points to prove it to you, was literally a merging or a convergence of the templates or scenarios, if you will, from one man, General Lyman Lemnitzer's, two proposed operations. One that happened that Kennedy agreed to, one he didn't. The Sky Shield 2 operation of the war game and Operation Northwoods of the mass murder or proposed, one of the scenarios was a proposed murder of U.S. civilians to blame on Cuba. The other one, an operation very similar to swapping the civilian airliner for a military plane they blow up and blame on another country as a pretext for invading. That's what we did. That's exactly what happened after the 9/11 attacks. They were used as a pretext first to invade Afghanistan, which had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11, and then to invade Iraq, which had absolutely nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11. Kennedy said no to Northwoods and removed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reassigning him, which was probably the dumbest thing Kennedy ever did, to be Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, then putting him in command, in the catbird seat, of all of the Operation Gladio false flag terror attacks from that point on. And again, that included mass murders to frame and blame the left. Now, Lemnitzer, I agree that Lemnitzer was or had to be central to the to the plot and the execution of the Kennedy assassination. Now, this is one of my shamelessly borrowed slides. The key to understanding the murder of President Kennedy resides with the concealed history of NATO and the Pentagon and their implementation and execution of CIA and U.S. military covert assassination networks. And as I mentioned from the Skorzeny Papers book that we talked about at the beginning, that everyone in the world needs to read the Skorzeny Papers, that book. The bottom line of those actual documents, that they were documents of Skorzeny himself, that he had put aside as kind of his insurance policy to make sure he wasn't assassinated, because if he was, there were instructions for it to go out to the world. So he lived to a pretty ripe age. He points the finger to the French assassinate at Dealey Plaza that our own U.S. military, probably Gladio operators, made sure they got out of Dallas the day after the assassination. So I'm going to go past some of these shamelessly borrowed slides because you can read those for yourself, and I hope you get my PowerPoint. But they're about Lemnitzer's central role in activating the French assassin that Mr. Gannis has identified as being at Dealey Plaza as one of the shooters. All right. Lemnitzer became Supreme Allied Commander of NATO after JFK said no to Operation Northwoods. And a major geostrategic goal, this is again similarities between 9/11 and the JFK assassination, a major geostrategic goal of both the JFK assassination and 9/11 was to harden NATO. Many people don't know this, but the first, and to this day only, official invoking of Article 5, the critical core mutual defense clause of the NATO treaty itself, was in the wake and justified not just by the September 11th attacks, but most importantly by the official lie of who attacked our country on 9/11. The official story is a complete lie. In the new NATO headquarters outside Brussels, Belgium, you are now looking at the dedication ceremony in May of 2017 of the new NATO headquarters, and there on this platform is a piece of the twisted World Trade Center steel from the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York on 9/11, and the reason, and it's actually called the 9/11 and Article 5 Memorial. One of the major geostrategic purposes and reasons for the false flag self-attack by our own deep state on the Pentagon and setting up the controlled demolition explosives inside the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7 on 9/11 was to cement and harden the link to NATO. How long do I have? One? Okay. All right, so the bottom line is I've gone through half my slides. So they're pretty explosive information. You've got a lot of it, but I would like you all to have my PowerPoint slides. So what I'm going to do is when I leave here during a break, I'm going to go up and I'm going to bring down my behind the smoke curtain, which will show you and prove to you what really happened and didn't at the Pentagon in 9/11, which has been called the new Pearl Harbor, hearkening back to the Nazis, to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was the new Pearl Harbor, and it was the Pentagon attack on 9/11 that made 9/11 into the new Pearl Harbor, not World Trade Center attacks in New York City. And when you see behind the smoke curtain, you will see what really happened and didn't on 9/11. and I would like you to have one of my videos, which I will bring a DVD, and also be sure and sign up to get the other half of my PowerPoints. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Barbara Honegger. Don't go away. No, a statement. I'm guessing you enjoyed that presentation. Are you glad you got to hear her? Yes. Well, one of the things that I was surprised I didn't hear her say, I don't think so. How many of you have heard of Barbara Honegger before today? Okay, a lot of you. So I think she is best known, at least in my experience, for a quote that she brought to the world. And I'll bet you most of you have heard it. I'm going to go ahead and try to paraphrase it, or why don't you just tell it, because I think you'll tell it best.
Okay. He's going to give me another 30 seconds. That's great. Okay, so what? More slides. Oh. I'll be happy to show you my slides anywhere later in the conference, okay? Just ask me to do it, I'll do it. What is being mentioned here is because I was a policy analyst and top aide to the Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to Reagan in the West Wing for the first almost 3 years. I was in many, many very important meetings, and one of the most important ones actually was sometime in late February. It was after Reagan's birthday, which was February 6th of 1981. Inauguration Day was January 20th, his birthday February 6th, and it was after that, and I know it was in February. So it was sometime in mid to late February of 1981 in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, West Wing, second floor? No, main floor, just across the hall from the cabinet room, just not far from the Oval Office. And it was a meeting just a few weeks after Reagan became president and Bush Sr. became vice president, when all of the cabinet secretaries, including people like Bill Casey, who technically wasn't a cabinet secretary in the sense that he wasn't confirmed by the Senate, but he was there. And all of the cabinet secretaries and Bill Casey, the CIA director, his new CIA director. And the purpose, Reagan was there, Bush wasn't. And I was the official recorder. And I was there because my boss, the Chief Domestic Policy Advisor, asked me to take the record. And so because I had to take the record, I was sitting right across from Bill Casey and Reagan. And the purpose of the meeting was for every one of his cabinet secretaries, after they'd had 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it was, not long, to see what was going on, to be briefed by the top echelon of their departments and agencies. There were 46 departments and agencies then in the U.S. government. The top ones, the ones that had Senate confirmation, plus Bill Casey of CIA, they were supposed to tell Reagan what they'd learned. What do your agencies and departments really do? I mean, what's the inside scoop? And they went around the table like, in kindergarten, right? And this was fascinating. I probably learned more in that meeting than almost anything else in my entire time in the White House. And when it got to Bill Casey, who mumbled, by the way, terribly, it's like he had marbles in his mouth, and I learned later that was done intentionally. They learn to do that when you're in the intelligence world, so that if you are taped, it's hard to tell what you're saying. But anyway, he was mumbling, and so I would have to lean in, and I heard very clearly, even though he was mumbling. So Reagan said, "Okay, Bill," because they were on first name terms. "So what goes on at the CIA, really?" And Casey said. He gave quite a spiel, but this is what stuck in my mind, and it was in my notes as I was taking them verbatim. He said, "Well, Mr. President, there's one thing that really is surprising to me, and that is that, Mr. President, do you realize that like 80 or maybe even 85% of everything those people at the CIA do on the intelligence side is just read newspapers and magazines and report about them? It's called open source intelligence." Well, that was the first thing he said to Reagan. And then Reagan asked the same question he asked all the other cabinet secretaries. He says, "Okay, Bill, after you've had your 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it was, what are your main goals for the agency?" And William Casey, who'd been a top operative running Western agents inside of Hitler's Germany. He's written a book, Casey wrote a book you can get on Amazon called Penetrating the Third Reich. He's in the OSS at a very high level. Now he's CIA director, which was merged into the CIA from the OSS. This is the top guy. And he turns to the president next to him and he says, "Well, Mr. President, we will have quote, when everything the American public believes is false, we will have succeeded in our disinformation campaign." Unquote. Now I could tell you in one more sentence why he said that was his goal, if you'd like to hear it. Okay, the reason Reagan said why, basically, in so many words. And Casey said, well, it's complicated, Mr. President, but the fundamental reason is that in an era of instant communications, in order to lie to our enemies and our geopolitical rivals, we have to lie to everyone, including the American people. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Barbara Honegger.